Hello there. Tonight I'm going to take you on a journey far back to ancient Japan, a time of extreme discipline and honor, a time when a select few chose an incredibly difficult, painfully disciplined, and often deadly way of life. Yes, tonight we are exploring the world of the Japanese samurai. Not just the obvious though. We will delve into the full, everyday life of what it would have been like to be a samurai, and explore their legacy that still forms much of today's modern Japanese society. So whether you are getting ready to settle down for the night, looking for a distraction from work, or maybe just looking to relax for a while, you've found the right place. Quiet the noise of the modern world, and prepare to step into a realm built on loyalty, duty, silence, and control. Imagine a silent warrior standing in the mist, his katana dripping with the blood of a fallen enemy. A noble figure defending his honor with a swift strike, his eyes burning with the unshakable calm of Bushido. You're not wrong, but you're not right either. What you're picturing is a myth, a shadow, a sliver of a much deeper, stranger, more human truth. Because the samurai weren't just warriors. They were bureaucrats. They were scholars. They were poets. They were fathers, husbands, spies, diplomats, and sometimes violent, brooding men trapped by a code that turned living into a performance and dying often into a virtue. This is not the story of the samurai you've been told. This is the one they never wanted you to hear. If you enjoyed tonight's story, I'd really appreciate it if you could give it a like, subscribe, or maybe comment on where you are listening from. Now sit back, relax, close your eyes, and we will begin our journey. Let's set the stage. Feudal Japan wasn't some grand sweeping epic painted in black ink on parchment. It was a rigid, brutal, and deeply hierarchical society where stepping out of line could cost you your head, literally. The emperor sat at the top in theory, a divine figure surrounded by ceremony, but real power was held by the shogun, the military dictator. Beneath him were the daimyo, the feudal lords, and under them, the samurai. They weren't kings, they weren't generals. They were more like managers of violence and order, enforcers of loyalty, instruments of power. But to understand a samurai's daily life, you have to understand this first. Most of them didn't spend their time in battle. Wars were brutal, yes, but also rare. Many samurai lived during times of peace, especially in the Edo period. They weren't soldiers. They were civil servants with swords. And that reality, it crushed many of them. Their katana, a weapon so iconic it has become almost sacred. But for the samurai, it was more than a tool. It was an extension of their identity. Losing it was like losing your soul. You see, the sword wasn't just meant to kill. It was a symbol, a burden. Samurai were required by law to wear two, the katana and the wakizashi. Not because they expected battle every day, but because it reminded everyone, including themselves, of who they were. People licensed to kill, but also people expected never to lose control. Imagine waking every day with the weight of a blade on your hip, and knowing that any misuse of it could destroy your family's reputation, get you banished, or worse, force you into seppuku. Ritual ending of your own life. That's not a weapon, that's a leash. Contrary to modern action films, a samurai wasn't valued just for his martial skill. In fact, a samurai who couldn't read, who couldn't write poetry, who couldn't discuss Confucian classics or quote Buddhist sutras, he was seen as crude, base, rouge even. Samurai were expected to be literate, articulate, disciplined. Many spent hours not practicing swordsmanship, but copying Chinese calligraphy, studying strategy, or memorizing codes of conduct. They had to learn how to think, because what good is a sword if the hand that wields it doesn't know when or why to draw it? But this discipline came at a price, because samurai lived under a crushing weight that dictated their every breath. Honor. Bushido, the way of the warrior, wasn't just a set of ideals. It was a system of psychological control. Honor was more important than life. A misplaced word, a dishonored lord, even a rumor could demand your death, not through combat, through seppuku, and not quietly. You had to cut open your own stomach while others watched, judging not just your resolve, but your composure. Imagine waking every day knowing that any mistake, even a political one, could end in you disemboweling yourself in front of your children. Still think being a samurai sounds good. In a samurai's world, nothing belonged to him, not even his time. His lord determined his schedule, his actions, even his thoughts. A samurai could be ordered to leave his home, abandon his family, kill an old friend, or die at any moment. Marriage was not for love, it was for alliance. Children were not to be spoiled. They were to be hardened, shaped into perfect mirrors of the code. Weakness, it was not tolerated. Tears, shameful. Mercy, dangerous. This was not a life of freedom. It was a life of obedience disguised as honor. So next time you hear about the noble samurai, the fearless warrior, the perfect soldier, poet, priest, remember this. Yes, they trained in swordsmanship. Yes, they lived by a code. But they also wrote poetry with hands that had killed. They bowed before men they despised. They smiled while planning the death of a friend. They died slowly, publicly, for errors as small as choosing the wrong words. The samurai's daily life was not a grand adventure. It was a performance, a chess match, a prison gilded with tradition, ritual, and an elegance that hid the ever-present threat of death. And this was just the beginning. Before the sun rose, before the birds began to sing, before the commoners even stirred in their homes, the samurai was already awake, because to be a samurai was to live in constant preparation, constant scrutiny, constant control. A samurai's life was not his own. It belonged to his daimyo, to the honor of his house, and to the code that governed every breath he took. His day began not with choice, but with ritual. There was no snooze button, no lazy mornings. A samurai was expected to rise well before dawn. The room was cold, intentionally so. Comfort was considered the enemy of discipline. In the darkness, he sat upright, cross-legged, eyes half closed, silent, and he meditated. This wasn't spiritual fluff. This was warfare, internal warfare, because a samurai was trained to master the battlefield inside his own mind long before he ever faced an opponent outside it. This early meditation, often influenced by Zen Buddhism, was about zanshin, the state of total awareness, total presence, to sit in stillness in the freezing quiet, with nothing but your own breath and thoughts, was seen as essential training. It built self-control. It crushed ego. It sharpened the spirit like a blade. To the outsider, it looked peaceful, serene. But make no mistake, this was war, against distraction, against fear, against desire. After meditation came cleansing. Bathing was not just hygienic, it was symbolic. A samurai would wash his face and hands, clean his mouth, and groom himself with precision. The body was a reflection of the soul. A dirty appearance reflected a disordered mind. This act, simple as it seemed, was a ritual of readiness, of purity, of preparing the self not just to live, but to serve. In Edo period castle towns, samurai quarters often had communal baths not luxurious, not private, but functional. Cleanliness was not optional, and unlike modern hygiene routines done in haste, a samurai approached even this with control. The goal was not to look good. The goal was to eliminate anything that could be considered sloppy, because sloppiness, in this world, could be fatal. Next came dressing, not in armor, not yet, but in layers of traditional clothing, each folded and tied in an exacting order. In peacetime, a samurai wore a kimono with a hakama, wide pleated trousers tied precisely at the waist. Over this, he might wear a haori, a short jacket often bearing his clan's crest. Each layer was a signal of class, of allegiance, of readiness, and most important of all, the daisho, the pair of swords, the long katana and the short wakizashi. They were slid into the sash, blade up, left side. To wear both swords was a right reserved only for samurai. It was a badge of rank and a warning. Even in times of peace, you wore your swords, even at breakfast, even when attending to paperwork, because they weren't just weapons. They were extensions of the samurai spirit. You never knew when your honor might be questioned, or when you might need to defend it. Now, if you imagine lively family breakfasts with laughter and chatter, forget it. A samurai household in the early hours was often marked by silence. Meals were simple: rice, pickled vegetables, maybe miso soup, perhaps dried fish if the household was wealthy. But food was not entertainment. It was fuel. To overindulge was dishonorable. To complain was unthinkable. Meals were taken quietly, reverently. Another opportunity to demonstrate discipline. Fathers were distant. Sons were expected to emulate them. Even young boys might wear miniature swords, trained from childhood to maintain composure at the table. And the moment breakfast ended, so did any illusion of comfort. Because it was time to train. For the average samurai, especially during the Tokugawa period, where peace reigned for centuries, battle was rare, but training, that was constant. Swordsmanship was foundational. Daily kenjutsu drills, the art of the sword, were carried out with bokken, wooden swords, in open courtyards or inside specially designated dojos. These sessions were not casual. They were brutal, fast, precision-focused. Footwork was drilled relentlessly. Strikes were delivered with explosive power. Kata, prearranged sequences of attack and defense, were practiced again and again, until muscle memory turned practice into reflex. Mistakes were corrected instantly. A lazy stance could earn you a cracked rib. A missed block might leave you bruised for days. There was no mercy, because on the battlefield, mistakes got you killed, and swordsmanship was just the beginning. Depending on status and training lineage, a samurai's morning might also include yabusame, mounted archery, an elite skill requiring terrifying coordination. Sojutsu, spear training, especially crucial during open field battles. Jujutsu, unarmed combat techniques used if disarmed or ambushed. Some trained in swimming in armor, yes, full suits, to prepare for river crossings or naval boarding. Others practiced horsemanship, since a skilled mounted warrior could be 10 times more deadly. This wasn't just physical conditioning, it was mental sharpening. Repetition was seen as holy. 1,000 cuts, 1,000 stances, 1,000 humiliating corrections, all to build a man who could kill without thinking and die without flinching. After physical practice, many samurai, especially those in service to a domain, were expected to study. This wasn't optional. A samurai who couldn't read a map, quote Confucius, or draft a letter to a superior wasn't respected. He was dangerous and replaceable. Scrolls were read, calligraphy practiced, moral codes memorized. One samurai described copying entire books by hand, not because he had to, but because the act itself was purifying. Like drawing your blade over and over until it becomes second nature, the brush was an extension of the mind. Education wasn't about freedom. It was about sharpening obedience. You didn't study to become enlightened. You studied to become useful. By the time the rest of the city or village stirred, when the merchants unlocked their stalls and farmers began their labor, the samurai had already trained, studied, eaten, and mentally prepared for the day. He was not cheerful. He was not relaxed. He was ready for orders, for duty, for discipline. Because to live one day without diligence was to bring shame upon your ancestors. And shame was worse than death. The morning routine of a samurai was not simply about preparation. It was about reduction, reducing the self, reducing weakness, reducing distraction. This was a lifestyle that didn't just demand control. It demanded the destruction of desire. You didn't wake up and ask, "What do I want to do today?" You woke up and asked, "What is required of me?" That's the real horror and the beauty of the samurai morning. It wasn't a ritual of freedom. It was a ritual of erasure. The self was polished away like a blade until nothing remained but function, form, and the cold clarity of duty. What comes next might surprise you. You think of a samurai. You do not picture a man hunched over a scroll, calculating tax quotas with an ink-stained brush. But if you had visited a Japanese castle in the 1600s, if you had walked through the inner chambers of Edo or Satsuma, or any major domain, that's exactly what you would have seen. Because when the battlefield fell silent, the samurai didn't vanish. He became something else entirely. A bureaucrat. Yes, a man of the sword, reduced to paper, protocol, and politics. Let's be clear. The samurai class earned its place in blood. For centuries, they were the warrior elite. Generals, swordsmen, and killers who decided the fate of kingdoms. But when peace came, most notably during the Edo period, around 1600, under the Tokugawa shogunate, everything changed. Japan stabilized. Internal wars ceased. The shogun enforced peace with an iron hand, and suddenly there weren't any battles left to fight. So what do you do with 2 million trained killers? You chain them to desks. The Tokugawa regime did something ingenious and sinister. They turned samurai into the administrative backbone of the state. You weren't just a soldier anymore. You were a clerk, a tax collector, a village inspector, a law enforcer, a messenger, a land assessor, a judge. So there they sat, day after day, inside the domain castles, jokamachi, at low wooden desks, hunched over scrolls, inkstones, and ledgers. They recorded rice production in exact bushels. They tallied harvests. They wrote letters to other domains. They audited the income of farmers and merchants. They drafted legal notices, marriage contracts, death declarations, and military orders that would never be used. A samurai might spend more time dipping his brush into ink than drawing his sword from its sheath. It was tedious. It was thankless. And for many, it was humiliating. But refusing this work, disobeying orders, that was dishonor. And dishonor still meant seppuku. You couldn't just be literate. You had to be fluent in calligraphy, Chinese characters, Buddhist philosophy, Confucian ethics, and the complex etiquette of communication between social classes. A poorly worded letter to a superior could trigger suspicion, or worse, accusation. Samurai had to memorize long-standing legal codes, village histories, clan lineages, and dozens of layers of diplomatic formality. If a peasant needed to petition the local daimyo for relief, a samurai had to file it, investigate it, and render a decision, all without ever raising his voice or showing partiality. Prefect judgment was everything. In many rural areas, the only government authority a village ever saw was the local samurai. He would ride into town in formal attire, with an entourage, carrying an iron box of documents and orders. He would conduct land surveys, question farmers, review tax assessments, resolve disputes, and issue rulings. These weren't metaphorical decisions. They had consequences. If a peasant was accused of theft, the samurai could sentence him to flogging. If a merchant violated price controls, the samurai could seize goods or issue heavy fines. But it wasn't always punishment. Sometimes it was mercy. A village devastated by typhoon might receive temporary relief if the samurai judged their suffering to be genuine, and if he was wrong, if he made a decision that brought shame upon his clan, his punishment could be public, swift, and fatal. So let's imagine the midday life of a mid-level samurai bureaucrat. He wakes early, trains, eats in silence, and then walks to the administrative wing of his lord's castle. He bows to the gatekeeper, removes his sandals, enters the wooden corridor, and takes his place at a writing desk in a chamber with 10, 20, 30 other men, all dressed in simple robes, all surrounded by scrolls, all working in silence broken only by the scratch of ink on paper. There is no conversation, no camaraderie, no banter. To speak out of turn is disrespectful. To show boredom is shameful. To nap is unthinkable. He writes letters for his superior, copies land records, reads a complaint from a farmer whose neighbor built a fence 3 inches too far to the left. He files reports, reviews the work of juniors, hands off documents to a courier, bows, steps back, sits. This is his life, every day, for months, for years, forever. But here's the cruel twist. The samurai may have been administrating wealth, but most weren't seeing any of it. They were paid in rice stipends, fixed by their rank. But as inflation increased, the price of rice stagnated. Many samurai couldn't afford to live up to the very appearance they were expected to maintain. So they went into debt. Quietly, shamefully. Some pawned their swords. Others took secret jobs as teachers or bodyguards, a violation of class law. Many drank, gambled. Some even became ronin, masterless samurai who had either lost their post or fled from shame. The ideal of the noble warrior, it was suffocating them. They weren't heroes anymore. They were functionaries, and it was driving many of them to despair. This is what made the life of a samurai so haunting. The world had changed, but the code hadn't. You were still expected to die for your honor, still expected to bow perfectly, write beautifully, discipline your children with cold detachment, train like war was coming tomorrow, even though it wasn't. You were a relic, a museum exhibit that still breathed. And every day that passed without war was a reminder you were no longer feared, just filed. So why didn't they rebel? Because the code wasn't just external, it was inside them. A samurai didn't need a sword to feel the blade. It was already in his chest, pointing inward. Many took pride in the pen. Some elevated administration into art. Others found purpose in governance, in helping the poor, in preserving order. But many, too many, suffered in silence, trapped between a myth that demanded perfection and a reality that offered none. And now we delve into the daily family life of a samurai family. When we think of samurai, we often forget that behind every stoic swordsman was a household shaped not by war, but by silence, ritual, and pressure. Because a samurai didn't just carry the weight of his blade, he carried the crushing burden of his name, his clan, his bloodline, and that burden was felt most deeply, not on the battlefield, but inside the home. A samurai household was not defined by wealth, but by austerity. Even mid-ranking samurai families lived in surprisingly modest homes, especially during the Edo period. Walls were made of thin paper, shoji, and wooden frames. Tatami mats lined the floor. Furniture was minimal. Decoration was sparse. Clutter was dishonorable. Why? Because the home was a reflection of the mind. A tidy, disciplined space reflected a tidy, disciplined soul. Even the arrangement of teacups, inkstones, or sandals was intentional. Nothing, and no one, was allowed to be out of place. This wasn't a home, it was a stage, a proving ground for discipline, a dojo in disguise. The beginnings of family life was also fairly bleak. Samurai marriage was rarely about love. It was about politics, status, and legacy. Most marriages were arranged, often by the heads of households or the daimyo themselves. A samurai's spouse was selected based on strategic value, family background, connections, potential dowries. Personality and common interests? Irrelevant. The wedding itself was steeped in ritual. The bride wore layers of white, not for purity, but for death, symbolizing the end of her former life. She was reborn into her husband's house, his rules, his world. And once married, her role was clear: obedience, dignity, silence. Yet surprisingly, within this system, women were far from powerless. Behind every disciplined samurai was a wife who ran the household with military precision. She managed the servants, handled the family finances, organized ancestral rituals, and in many cases, educated the children. She was expected to be cultured, literate, well-versed in poetry, calligraphy, and etiquette, but also capable of defense. Some women trained in the naginata, a long pole weapon designed to give them reach against male attackers. Because if the home was invaded while the husband was away, the wife was expected to fight or die trying. This duality made the samurai wife one of the most complex figures in Japanese history. Poised, elegant, and deadly if needed. A samurai child's life also began fiercely, not with lullabies and toys, but with expectations. From birth, sons were seen not as children, but as future soldiers, future judges, future martyrs to the code. Daughters were future wives and household commanders, expected to carry the burden of tradition with unflinching grace. Affection, it existed, but it was restrained, controlled. A father did not play with his children. He taught them, tested them, measured them. He watched to see if they flinched when scolded, if they bowed deeply enough, if they hesitated when practicing sword forms. To cry was weakness. To speak without permission was insolence. To question authority, even at 5 years old, was a sign of dangerous ego. Discipline began early, sometimes with words, often with the wooden sword, a tool used for both training and punishment. By the age of 7, a samurai boy was often sent to a terrakoya, a temple school, or a private academy, depending on his family's rank. He learned to read, write, and study the 4 books and 5 classics of Confucianism. He memorized passages about duty, virtue, and hierarchy. He was taught not just how to think, but how to submit. History, law, literature, etiquette, all wrapped in a strict moral framework that elevated loyalty above life, obedience above feeling. Girls, too, were educated, often at home. They learned to read and write, to perform tea ceremonies, compose poetry, and recite proper etiquette. But they also learned how to wield a weapon, how to bow in submission, and how to kill if necessary. Everything inside this heavily disciplined samurai household revolved around one word: legacy. Every meal eaten, every word spoken, every mistake made reflected on generations, past and future. A child didn't just carry his own name. He carried his ancestors, their deeds, their sacrifices, and if he failed, if he brought shame upon the house, that shame would stain not just his name, but the names of his unborn descendants. So a samurai child lived with constant pressure to perform, to conform, to be perfect. There were no teenage years in the Western sense. By the time a boy turned 13, he was considered a man in training, responsible for his family's name and his own eventual death with honor. Inside the samurai home, even private life was a performance. Husbands and wives often communicated through formal gestures, indirect language, and ritualized behavior. Fathers expected to be obeyed without question. Mothers carried the emotional weight of the household without showing visible strain. Joy was quiet. Suffering was hidden. Anger was dangerous. A samurai family didn't argue. They bowed. They exchanged carefully worded phrases. They expressed disappointment with subtle glances. Discipline was often silent, but absolute. The home was not a refuge. It was a crucible. But beneath all the ceremony, they were still human. There were moments of quiet tenderness. A father placing a calligraphy brush into his son's small hand. A mother stroking her daughter's hair while reciting poetry by candlelight. A sibling helping another adjust their kimono before school. These glimpses of love, of softness, were real. But they had to live in secret, tucked between layers of obligation and the ever-present fear of failure. Because no matter how kind a samurai was, the code came first. And when tragedy struck, when a child died from illness or a wife passed in childbirth, grief had no outlet. A samurai could not wail in public, could not collapse, could not scream at the gods. He was expected to mourn with dignity, to write poetry about impermanence, to burn incense, to bow at the altar, and return to his duties without faltering. To grieve too much was weakness. To grieve too little was dishonor. Even death, in a samurai family, was something to perform. Now, imagine walking through a town where every eye watches you. Every bow is measured. Every misstep, no matter how small, could result in a beating or a death. This was not a dream. This was not paranoia. This was daily life for a samurai in public. Because when a samurai left his home, he didn't just step outside. He stepped onto a stage. A single act of disrespect, even accidental, could explode into a cascade of violence, shame, or ruin. And the irony? Most samurai weren't looking for a fight. They were trying desperately to avoid one. During the Edo period, most samurai lived in jokamachi, castle towns built around the fortress of their lord. These towns were segregated by class. At the top, quite literally, sat the castle, a towering symbol of power. Below it, the samurai district, then the merchant quarters, then the artisans, and finally, at the outer edge, the peasants. It wasn't just geography, it was hierarchy in wood and stone. A samurai walking through town was expected to project absolute composure. His clothing, posture, and gait were tightly regulated by unspoken rules. He couldn't walk too fast. It looked suspicious. Too slow. It looked arrogant. Every step had to whisper the same thing. I am in control. A samurai in public wore his hakama carefully folded, his haori jacket clean, his clan crest visible. His swords, both the katana and wakizashi, were properly tucked into his obi sash. Not too loose, not too tight. A disheveled appearance was not just embarrassing, it was threatening. It suggested instability, or worse, disrespect for his rank. And disrespect had consequences. Because walking through a town as a samurai wasn't about power. It was about restraint and the ability to exercise or withhold lethal force. Picture this. A merchant rushes out of his shop to make a delivery. In his haste, he doesn't notice the samurai passing nearby. He fails to bow, maybe even brush his shoulders by accident. Now the samurai stops, slowly, turns. The merchant drops to his knees, face pale, because even a slight touch could be seen as a breach of a samurai's space, his dignity, his invisible armor of respect. Some samurai, especially younger, more volatile ones, would draw their swords right there in the street, and legally, they could. It was called kirisu gomen, permission to cut and depart. If you insulted a samurai's honor and he killed you on the spot, the law would back him up, as long as he reported it and could justify his action, which, in a world governed by pride and fear, wasn't hard to do. The Tokugawa government feared this power, and with good reason. Too many samurai abusing their right to kill could destabilize entire towns. Riots, revenge, clans going to war over spilled blood. So while kirisu gomen was legal, it came with strings. Samurai were required to file detailed reports. Witnesses were questioned. False claims could lead to punishment. The message was clear. Yes, you may strike. But if you do, you'd better be right. This led to a strange paradox. Samurai were feared, but also scrutinized. Powerful, but constantly under pressure to behave with perfect decorum. One false move, and you weren't a warrior. You were a thug. And yet, the greatest threat often didn't come from merchants or peasants. It came from other samurai, because beneath the surface of polite bows and quiet streets was a jungle of political tension. Every smile could be a lie. Every casual visit, a reconnaissance. Every childhood friend could one day be ordered to assassinate you in your sleep. Feuds between clans simmered for years. Disputes over land, marriage alliances, court promotions. They festered behind fans and scrolls, waiting for a spark. And when one came, it was never loud. It was quiet, surgical. A samurai might leave for work and never return. His body discovered in an alley. His killer long gone, protected by another domain. Revenge was never openly spoken, but it was never forgotten. In this world of invisible daggers, etiquette became your shield. You bowed at the correct angle. You spoke with the proper tone. You deferred, subtly but unmistakably, to those of higher rank, and never spoke first unless invited. Even fan placement mattered. Yes, fans. To place your fan on the left side of your tea bowl, rather than the right, in certain settings. It could be read as arrogance. To adjust your sword while seated in a room could be interpreted as a challenge. This wasn't manners. This was a language of survival. Samurai spent years studying it, not because they loved formality, but because one mistake could cost their head. So let's return to that samurai walking through town. He moves with quiet grace. His eyes scan the crowd, but never dart. His hand rests lightly on the hilt of his sword, not clutching it, not drawing it, just touching. A signal. His back is straight. His footsteps are even. He does not smile. He does not frown. His face is a mask carved from self-control. He passes a group of children. They bow instinctively. He nods once, barely. A merchant sweeps the street ahead of him, keeping distance. Every person he passes knows what he is, and he knows they know. But here's the part most people don't understand. Most samurai never drew their swords in public, not once, because real power was in not needing to. The greatest samurai were not the quickest to strike, but the ones who could diffuse a threat with a look, a bow, a perfectly timed word that said, "I could destroy you, but I choose not to." To be a samurai in public was to be a flame held behind glass. It could burn everything around it, but only if the glass cracked. Now we delve into the unpleasant world of seppuku. There is perhaps no image more haunting or more misunderstood than that of the samurai who kneels calmly before his own death. His hands do not tremble. His breath is steady, his eyes unblinking. He bows once, speaks a final poem, and then, with complete control, he opens his own body with steel. To the Western mind, it's often seen as madness, a barbaric act, death born of failure. But to the samurai, it was something else entirely. It was salvation. It was redemption. It was freedom. Because sometimes, in a world ruled by shame, the only way to prove your worth was to die. Let's be clear. Seppuku, often called harakiri in crude Western slang, was not spontaneous. It was not hysterical. It was not emotional. It was a ritual, a performance, a statement. The act itself was simple but horrifying. A samurai dressed in white would kneel in the formal Caesar position. Before him, a short blade, usually a tanto or wakizashi, was placed on a white cloth. He would bow, recite his death poem, and then, with both hands, plunge the blade into the left side of his abdomen. The cut would move from left to right, and often upward. A slow, excruciating death by evisceration. But before the agony could overtake him, a second, the kaishakunin, would step forward and swiftly decapitate him from behind. This was the mercy stroke, and it had to be perfect. Being chosen as a kaishakunin was not an honor. It was a responsibility that could scar you for life. You had to wait for the exact moment, not too early, or it would be dishonor. Not too late, or your friend would suffer needlessly. Your cut had to be clean, and just enough to sever the spine. Miss, and you brought shame to yourself, the condemned, and the entire ceremony. Some seconds practiced for days in private before the event, not because they feared violence, but because they feared failing to be merciful. Seppuku was not always punishment. Sometimes it was a gift, the final chance to reclaim honor that had been lost. A samurai who failed in duty, disobeyed orders, lost a battle, or brought shame to his family might be ordered, or offered, the chance to end his life on his own terms. It was not seen as defeat. It was seen as transcendence. Because in a world where honor was greater than survival, dying with control meant dying undefeated. To finish yourself before the world could judge you. That was the ultimate act of samurai discipline. There were two main types of seppuku. Voluntary seppuku. The samurai chose to take his own life to avoid capture, atone for failure, or express protest. This was the most noble form, done with ritual, witnesses, and full honors. Judicial seppuku. The samurai was ordered to die, usually by his lord or the shogun's court. In these cases, seppuku replaced execution. It allowed the condemned to die as a man of honor, not a criminal. But make no mistake, even the ordered form was considered preferable to hanging like a commoner. To die without shame, to leave behind a legacy untainted by cowardice. That was the goal. And make no mistake, seppuku was a performance. Witnesses were required, often fellow samurai, sometimes officials, sometimes even the victim's own family. There was a script, a process. White robes, the color of death. A death poem written in elegant calligraphy, sometimes incense, sometimes sake, always silence. The condemned would kneel on a low platform. A screen might be placed behind him to catch the blood. Servants would place the blade. The second would step into position. Everything was watched, judged. There was no rehearsal. But why would a man do this? Why not run? Why not refuse? Because from birth, a samurai was taught that his life belonged to something greater than himself, his lord, his clan, the code. To disobey was worse than death. To live in shame was to poison the bloodline. And there was something else, something darker. The self, with its fears, doubts, desires, was considered an illusion, a distraction. To master it, to destroy it willingly, was the highest proof of enlightenment. Seppuku was not just a gesture of honor. It was a final conquest over the fear of death itself. Before the blade ever touched skin, there was poetry, a jisei, death poem, written in the hours or minutes before the act. They were usually brief, elegant, haunting. These were not cries of despair. They were statements of clarity, of readiness. Even in death, the samurai was expected to compose himself, to reduce the chaos of dying to a single perfect line. Seppuku wasn't rare, nor was it always tragic. General Nogi Maresuke, after the death of Emperor Meiji in 1912, disemboweled himself, and his wife followed suit, a final act of loyalty. Ironically, the act was often more about the living. It sent a message to rivals, to allies, to future generations. It said, "I will not be used. I will not be shamed. I end this here with dignity intact." For the samurai class, it served as a form of social glue, a way of saying, "This is who we are, even in death." And for those who watched, it was a warning, a challenge, a standard. Could you do the same? It's easy now to view all this as insane, to scoff, to shake our heads. But remember this, the samurai didn't fear death. They feared dishonor, not because it hurt, but because it lasted. Today we spend our lives trying to avoid death. They spent theirs preparing for it, and when the time came, they met it not with screams, but with a bow, a poem, and a blade. And for the samurai, death was not the end. It was an evaluation, a crossing, a judgment, not by courts or gods, but by the code that governed everything they were. To live as a samurai meant to prepare, not just for how you would fight or serve or fall on your blade, but for what happened after, what happened to the soul. Because while the samurai were men of steel and silence, they were also men of deep belief. And those beliefs shaped how they lived and how they died. Samurai belief wasn't monolithic. It was a blend, a quiet storm of Zen Buddhism, Confucian ethics, and Shinto tradition. Each played a role. Zen Buddhism gave the samurai discipline, meditation, the notion of impermanence, that all things, including life, are fleeting like a falling blossom. Shinto rooted them in place, in land, ancestors, and ritual purity. It said the spirits of the dead lingered and must be honored. Confucianism wasn't a religion, but a code. It taught loyalty, hierarchy, and moral duty to one's lord and family. Together, these formed the spiritual armor of the samurai. Not loud, not dramatic, but solid, unshakable. To the samurai, ghosts, yurei, were not just stories. They were facts of life. If a warrior died unjustly, or with rage in his heart, or without proper burial rites, he might linger. There are countless records in Edo period journals of samurai seeing spirits. Not metaphorically, literally. Ghosts walking castle corridors, spirits in moonlit fields, the dead appearing to deliver final messages or demands for revenge. Fear of ghosts influenced behavior. Bodies had to be buried correctly. Souls appeased with incense, offerings, prayers. Seppuku itself, painful as it was believed to calm the spirit by giving it a clean, honorable departure. To die badly was dangerous, not just to you, but to everyone around you. And now we move on to the daily ancestral worship in samurai homes. There was almost always a butsudan, a Buddhist altar, or a kamedana, a Shinto god shelf. Every morning, incense was lit. Prayers were whispered. Sometimes offerings of rice, salt, or water were placed for deceased parents, grandparents, even children. The dead weren't gone. They were watching. A samurai was expected to represent his ancestors in everything he did. Their honor flowed through his veins. Their shame clung to his name. You didn't just act with dignity for yourself. You acted because your great-grandfather might be listening. In this way, a samurai never stood alone. Buddhism brought another layer to the samurai view on worship and death. Rebirth. The belief was that the soul would reincarnate, cycling through life after life until achieving enlightenment and escape from suffering, nirvana. But how you were reborn, that depended on your karma. Die with hatred or deceit, you might come back as an animal, a beggar, a soul cursed to wander. Die with discipline, loyalty, and clarity. You could be reborn as a stronger, wiser warrior, or perhaps escape the cycle altogether. Some samurai wrote death poems that referenced this directly, declaring their hope not for peace, but for another battle in the next life. Because service never ended, not even after death. We've seen how samurai composed jisei, death poems, before dying. But what's most revealing is the content of those final words. They rarely begged for mercy. They never cursed fate. Instead, they often focused on transience. The idea that life is like mist on the river or dew on a blade of grass. Here one moment, gone the next. Take this example. Like dew I was born, like dew I vanish, all that's left, the voice of the cicada. These weren't just beautiful phrases. They were declarations of acceptance, proof that the samurai had not clung to life, that he understood. To let go was power. For the samurai, death, especially an honorable one, could be cleansing. It washed away failure, sin, shame, not just for the individual, but sometimes for the family. A disgraced samurai could restore his name by choosing seppuku. A son might volunteer for a dangerous mission to atone for a father's corruption. Death was not a punishment. It was a tool. Used properly, it could bring balance back to a world tilted by dishonor. Yet, despite all this preparation, belief, and ritual, not every samurai died with honor. Some fled from battle. Some were captured and executed like criminals. Some refused seppuku and were hanged. Some died drunk in alleyways, cut down in meaningless squabbles. Even among the most disciplined, failure lurked. And when that happened, the afterlife beliefs changed. A dishonored soul might be erased from records, denied burial near the family, omitted from prayers. In extreme cases, their name would be struck from ancestral tablets, as if they had never existed, To die badly wasn't just physical defeat, it was spiritual exile. So what do all these beliefs tell us? That for the samurai, the afterlife wasn't about comfort. It wasn't a place to rest. It was a continuation, a mirror of how you lived. And that meant death had to be approached with intention, with discipline, with control. Because whether you became a ghost, a Buddha, or a forgotten name in a burned scroll was entirely up to you. For 800 years, the samurai were Japan's ruling class, feared, revered, and unchallenged. But by the late 1800s, the world changed. And the samurai, they were left behind. Few things in history are ever permanent. This is now not the story of warriors who died gloriously in battle. This is the story of men who lived long enough to see their entire way of life erased by steam engines, rifles, and government reform. They weren't killed by enemies, they were killed by irrelevance. For over 2 centuries, Japan lived in isolation under the Tokugawa shogunate, a time of strict order, peace, and rigid class hierarchy. The samurai thrived, not as soldiers, but as bureaucrats, scholars, and symbols of power. They lived off stipends from their lords, carried swords in public, held positions in administration. But beneath the surface, cracks had already begun to form. The economy modernized, merchant wealth soared. Samurai, paid in rice stipends, found themselves increasingly poor, unable to keep up with rising costs or the demands of aristocratic appearance. And then, in 1853, everything shattered. The black ships arrived. When American Commodore Matthew Perry sailed into Tokyo Bay with steam-powered warships and demanded that Japan open to trade, the illusion of invincibility evaporated. Japan realized it had fallen centuries behind the West, technologically, militarily, economically. And the Tokugawa shogunate, it looked fragile, ineffective, weak. Within years, civil unrest exploded, domains split, protests rose, and a new political movement emerged, one that would change everything. In 1868, Emperor Meiji was restored to power, and the centuries-old shogunate collapsed. This wasn't just a change in leadership, it was a revolution, social, economic, and cultural. The Meiji government wanted to modernize, fast. That meant building railways, creating a national army, westernizing education, centralizing power in Tokyo, and most of all, it meant abolishing the samurai class. In the early 1870s, the government issued a series of devastating reforms. Stipends were cut, then replaced with bonds that rapidly lost value. Hereditary samurai titles were abolished. Class distinctions were erased. Legally, everyone was now just a citizen. And in 1876, the final blow, the Heitere Edict, a ban on wearing swords in public. For a samurai, this was more than disarmament. It was humiliation. The daisho, once the symbol of honor and authority, was now contraband, a museum piece. Imagine a Marine being told to hand over his uniform and become a janitor. That's what it must have felt like. With no stipend, no rank, and no rights, many former samurai were forced to find new work. Some became teachers or policemen. Others became merchants, a job once beneath them. Some learned Western languages and became diplomats or engineers. But many couldn't adapt. They had spent their entire lives being trained for a world that no longer existed. They weren't just unemployed, they were unmade. A lifetime of ritual, hierarchy, and discipline. And now they were just another face in a crowd. The quiet dignity they had built for centuries, drowned in the noise of the modern age. Yet, not everyone accepted this quietly. Throughout the 1870s, former samurai staged uprisings against the Meiji government. The most famous of these was the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, led by legendary samurai Saigo Takamori. A devout believer in Bushido, Saigo couldn't accept the erasure of samurai values. He gathered over 20,000 former warriors and marched on the imperial army. They were outnumbered, outgunned, fighting rifles and artillery with swords and conviction. They lost. Saigo committed seppuku after the final battle, not just for honor, but as a symbol of everything the samurai had stood for. It was the last stand of the warrior class, and it ended in silence. Here's the twist. Even as the Meiji government tried to eliminate the samurai, it stole their image. They used Bushido, the very code that defined samurai, as the moral foundation of their new national identity. The military was rebuilt, now using samurai discipline to train conscripted farmers and townsfolk. Textbooks praised samurai loyalty, even as the men themselves were left to rot. It was as if Rome had destroyed its legions, but still taught its children Latin. For many former samurai, this transition wasn't just political or financial, it was existential. They had spent their entire lives being told they were superior, chosen, sacred. Now they were irrelevant, their code mocked, their swords banned, their language outdated. Some drank themselves into obscurity. Some committed seppuku, not as ritual, but as despair. Others lived into old age as shadows, watching factories rise where dojos once stood. They didn't just lose jobs, they lost purpose. And for a samurai, that was worse than death. Ironically, as the samurai disappeared, the idea of the samurai exploded. Foreign photographers paid men to dress up in armor for stage portraits. Writers romanticized the noble, tragic warrior. Tourists bought fake swords, calligraphy scrolls, and tales of honor. Japan had turned the samurai into a brand, an aesthetic, a museum piece for the modern age. The men themselves, they no longer mattered. Only their image remained. With the fall of the samurai, Japan gained a modern military, a stronger economy, a centralized government. But it also lost something. It lost a class that had dedicated itself, for better or worse, to discipline, duty, and self-sacrifice. It lost an ideal that had been practiced, not preached. And even today, in the steel and glass towers of modern Tokyo, the ghost of the samurai lingers. In business etiquette, martial arts, poetry, and the unspoken pressure to perform with silent perfection. The samurai may be gone, but Japan still bows to their shadow. The last real samurai died more than a century ago. Their swords are in museums, their homes, historical sites, their ranks abolished, their code no longer law, and yet they're still here, not in armor, not in flesh, but in behavior, in culture, in cinema, in silence. The samurai may be gone, but their legacy has soaked into the bones of modern Japan and far beyond. This is not nostalgia, this is inheritance. And like a sword passed down through generations, it still cuts. Modern martial arts, kendo, judo, karate, aikido, all trace their spiritual roots to samurai tradition. It's not just about fighting, it's about discipline. In kendo, students wear armor reminiscent of samurai gear and wield bamboo swords called shinai. They don't just swing and score. They bow, they shout, they observe strict etiquette. You don't fight the opponent. You fight yourself, your fear, your laziness, your ego. This is pure Bushido, stripped of blood, but still razor sharp. Even children in judo are taught to bow before and after matches, not to win, but to show respect. The battle ends with humility. That's the samurai whispering through centuries. It might seem strange, but Japanese business culture is also deeply shaped by the samurai mindset. Loyalty to the company mirrors a samurai's loyalty to his lord. Seniority-based hierarchy mirrors feudal ranking. Endless attention to detail and perfection in process. That's centuries of samurai etiquette refined into corporate precision. Even the work ethic, staying late, putting the group before the individual, enduring without complaint, stems from Bushido values: duty, endurance, and silent service. It's not always healthy. Burnout, overwork, and emotional suppression are real problems. But the roots are clear. The Japanese salaryman may wear a suit instead of armor, but the pressure, the structure, the expectations, those are forged from the same steel. And in the cinema, the samurai have not only survived, they've gone global. Kurosawa's Seven Samurai, 1954, didn't just change Japanese film. It rewired world cinema. It was remade in the West as The Magnificent Seven, but the core message remained. A warrior's duty is not to power, but to protection. Kurosawa's lone swordsman, drifting through injustice, upholding honor in a corrupt world, became the blueprint for the modern anti-hero. You see it in Clint Eastwood's Man with No Name, in Batman, in The Mandalorian, the lone figure who lives by a code, who walks away from comfort, who is ready to die for something greater. That's a samurai, just wearing different clothes. Bushido is now more than a warrior's rulebook. It's a philosophy, one that values self-control, service, and impermanence. Modern Japanese culture reflects this in 1,000 subtle ways. Minimalism in design and lifestyle, the samurai belief in austerity, precision in calligraphy, tea ceremony, or craftsmanship, the samurai habit of mastery, restraint in emotion, the old samurai rule: feel deeply, express quietly. Even in crisis, Japan is known for orderly behavior, communal care, and stoic endurance. That's not coincidence. That's the ghost of Bushido, still keeping people in line. Many Japanese children still learn about samurai in school. But more than the facts, names, battles, dates, they absorb the ideals. To endure hardship with dignity, to apologize with sincerity, to act not for personal gain, but collective good. The language still carries traces of samurai life. Words like giri, duty or obligation; on, a favor or debt of gratitude; seppuku, still used metaphorically, to describe self-inflicted ruin through honor. Even in slang, the vocabulary of the blade persists. The samurai may be history, but they still speak. And here's a twist. While Bushido was about obedience, modern activists sometimes invoke the samurai to justify protest. Think of a whistleblower who exposes corruption, knowing it will destroy his career, or a protester who stages a symbolic act of defiance, not for fame, but to awaken conscience. These people often call themselves modern samurai, not because they fight with swords, but because they're willing to sacrifice for principle. It's ironic. The samurai upheld the system. Now their legacy sometimes fuels those who challenge it. Samurai are everywhere now, not just in textbooks or tea houses, but in games, comics, and cosplay. Ghost of Tsushima turned historical samurai into an interactive epic. Samurai Jack, a Western cartoon, explored themes of solitude, sacrifice, and time. Rurouni Kenshin, a manga and anime series, followed a swordsman who swears never to kill again. A samurai fighting not to uphold the code, but to escape its violence. These aren't just tributes, they're reinterpretations. The samurai has become a symbol we mold to fit our times, as hero, wanderer, rebel, or ghost. And it's not just Japan. Worldwide, people are drawn to the samurai ideal. Martial artists adopt samurai principles in dojos from Sao Paulo to Sydney. CEOs read about Bushido as a leadership guide. Soldiers study Hagakure, the samurai text on death and duty. Why? Because even in a chaotic modern world, there's something seductive about the idea of living with clarity, with discipline, with a code. We may not always agree with the code, but we respect the commitment. So what's left? A myth, a brand, a ghost, or something more? Perhaps the true legacy of the samurai is not violence or war or obedience, but this, that it's possible to live with principle, that duty can matter more than comfort, that silence can be strength, that discipline can be love, and that the way you live and die can echo beyond your own life, not because you were loud, but because you were precise. As we reflect, we know the samurai are gone. No more war horses on the roads, no more armor glinting in the sun, no more bowed heads at the foot of a shogun's castle. And yet, they remain, in ink and etiquette, in silence and sacrifice, in the space between who we are and who we aspire to be. This story has taken us far from the battlefield, because real samurai life wasn't a blur of jewels and glory. It was something deeper, quieter, and infinitely more human. So as we look back at the beginning, the samurai did not rise from poetry. They rose from violence, hired swords on Japan's distant frontiers. Farmers turned enforcers. Bandits turned protectors. But through generations of loyalty, discipline, and relentless self-mythology, they became something else. A caste, a culture, a code. By the time of the Tokugawa shogunate, the samurai were no longer just warriors. They were administrators, judges, philosophers, and symbols. Bushido wasn't a list of rules. It was a way of being, honor, loyalty, restraint, readiness to die, but also compassion, discipline, and humility. It wasn't about killing well. It was about living right. Samurai didn't seek battle. They prepared for it, physically, mentally, and spiritually. Even their swordsmanship was often more about not using the blade than using it. But with peace came paper. Most samurai in the Edo period spent their days writing reports, enforcing policy, and performing ritual. The sword gathered dust, while ink stained their fingers. Yet, the discipline remained. They served their lords through precision, not violence. They became civil servants with the soul of warriors. It was a slow, suffocating shift, from battlefield glory to bureaucratic silence. At home, the code continued. Wives were managers, educators, warriors in their own right. Children were trained from birth to carry legacy, to never show weakness, to never dishonor the name. Love existed, but it was quiet, controlled, expressed not in words, but in shared tea, poetry, and posture. The home wasn't refuge, it was training ground. Every step in public was a test. Dress, gait, speech. Every bow was measured. Every glance could be misread. Even the wrong kind of silence could start a fight. The samurai lived under constant scrutiny, from commoners, from rivals, from their own shadow. To be a samurai was to never let the mask slip, even when death was a breath away. Seppuku, ritual death, was not insanity. It was design, a final act of control, a cleansing of shame, a restoration of balance. It was not weakness, it was proof. Proof that the samurai lived by his code so fully. He was willing to die by it, with clarity and calm. And when death came, it was not an ending. Samurai believed the soul lingered, that ancestors watched, that improper death could curse the land. They wrote poetry before dying. They meditated on impermanence. They lived as if death might come today, and prepared to meet it with stillness. Even their ghosts obeyed ritual. And then it all collapsed. Modernization swept through Japan. Guns replaced swords. Railroads replaced horses. The samurai were stripped of status, income, even their right to carry weapons. Some adapted, some rebelled. Many faded into silence. Their lives now stories rather than substance. They weren't defeated in battle. They were erased by progress. And yet, their code survives. In martial arts, in business ethics, in films, philosophy, architecture, and language. The bow before a match, the perfect brushstroke, the silent endurance in the face of hardship. These are not remnants. These are living echoes. You can still feel them. In the quiet of a Japanese tea house, the order of a Kyoto alley, or the stillness before a kendo match begins. The samurai are not gone. They're translated. So what can we take from all this? Not the violence, not the hierarchy, not the wars, but the idea that there can be beauty in discipline, grace in restraint, strength in silence. The samurai weren't perfect. Many were cruel, arrogant, hypocritical. But even in their contradictions, they wrestled with questions we still ask today. And we should keep asking ourselves, how do you live with dignity in a broken world? How do you serve something greater than yourself? How do you face death and life without flinching? The answer wasn't in their swords. It was in their stillness. Thank you for coming on this journey with me tonight. I truly hope you go on to have a wonderful night's sleep and restful dreams. If you enjoyed this story, I'd appreciate it if you could like, subscribe, and maybe even comment on other places you would like to visit, and I'll try and make it happen. But for now, settle down, relax, close your eyes, and drift off. May sound sleep and beautiful dreams come to you tonight. You deserve it.